examine another event in Jewish history in which God's covenant with Abraham played a tremendous role. We all love to tell of the power Moses had with God. You remember that while Moses was up in the mountain with God receiving the 10 Commandments, which were written with God's own finger, the wicked Israelites were playing the harlot. They were actually bowing down and offering sacrifices to an idol, a golden calf, which Aaron, the brother of Moses, had shaped and made for them. Under such appalling conditions as these, why did Moses still have power with God concerning these people? Why did God hear and answer the prayers Moses prayed on their behalf? As you will see in these next scriptures, it was once again God's covenant with Abraham that gave Moses power with God and stayed the hand of the Lord from destroying this evil group of people. The only reason why the descendants of these wicked Israelites still exist today is because of God's promise to his devoted friend Abraham. For though Israel deserved to die, God spared them in order to keep his solemn pledge to Abraham. God had to protect his name. He had to protect his reputation. God could not break his promise for all the world to see. If he would have done this, it would have caused the nations to misunderstand his intentions and fail to trust him from then on. Turn to Exodus 32, 7 through 14. Verse 7. The Lord said to Moses, "Go down, for your people whom you brought out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves." Here, God is so disgusted that he tells Moses, "Your people, whom you brought out of the land of Egypt." The Hebrews were so wicked that God wanted to disown them. He said to Moses in verse 8, "They have turned aside quickly out of the way which I commanded them. They have made them a molten calf, and have worshipped it and sacrificed to it, and said, 'These are your gods, O Israel, that brought you up out of the land of Egypt.'" No wonder God wanted to disown this rebellious bunch of people. No wonder God wanted to wipe them off the face of the earth, to utterly destroy them. Verse 9. And the Lord said to Moses, "I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and that I may destroy them. But I will make of you a great nation." So God wanted to get rid of every one of Abraham's descendants except for Moses. He wanted to start all over again from scratch. But the Lord had promised Abraham many things, and he had to keep these promises. And in addition to this, there stood Moses with total trust and confidence that God would keep these promises without wavering at all from his word. By now, you may be asking, but why couldn't God destroy this corrupt bunch of people and raise up more descendants of Abraham through his righteous servant Moses? The answer to your question is in Genesis 15, 13 through 16. We have already studied this portion of Scripture once, but let's read it again so we can gain even more insight and truth about this matter. Let's read verses 13, 14, and 16. Verse 13. And God said to Abram, "Know positively that your descendants will be strangers dwelling as temporary residents in a land that is not theirs, Egypt, and will be slaves there, and they will be afflicted and oppressed for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on that nation whom they will serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions." Now verse 16. And in the 4th generation they shall come back here to Canaan again. For the iniquity of the Amorites, name of the most important group of that region, and later included the people of all Canaan, is not yet full and complete. In these verses, God told Abraham that the Israelites would spend 400 years as slaves in Egypt. He goes on to tell Abraham how he will judge Egypt for their wicked actions. And after 400 years, 4 generations of slavery, he will deliver these slaves out of Egypt with great wealth. Moses alone did not fit this bill. You see, to keep this promise, God must use Abraham's descendants, who were oppressed, afflicted, and enslaved in Egypt. We all know that Moses was never oppressed or enslaved in Egypt. Moses had not been afflicted. On the contrary, Moses was raised as Egyptian royalty. He had received the best education possible. He had been accepted and reared as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. God could not fulfill his words with Moses alone. As rotten as these people were, God still needed them if he was going to keep his promise. God said in verse 16, after 400 years of slavery, Abraham's descendants shall return to Canaan, which they did. However, God could not allow them to remain there the first time they arrived because of their awful sin. If you're not familiar with these events, read chapters 13 and 14 of the book of Numbers after the lesson. As a result of Israel's disobedience to God's word, she was severely punished. She was forced to wander aimlessly in the wilderness for 40 years before she was eventually allowed to return to the promised land and take possession of it. Let's take up now where we left off in Exodus 32, verses 11 through 14. Moses reminds God that because he loved Abraham, he chose these people. He reminds God that they are his people and he cannot disown them. He reminds God that because he loved Abraham, he was the one who brought them out of Egypt. And he must not destroy them now. So Moses cautions God and tells him that if he destroys this people, everyone would be left with the impression that he destroyed Abraham's descendants and broke his covenant because it was too hard for the God of Israel to keep his promise. He told God, Lord, the nations will believe that you brought these people out of Egypt only to do them harm. Verse 11. But Moses besought the Lord his God and said, Lord, why does your wrath blaze hot against your people, whom you have brought forth out of the land of Egypt with great power and mighty hand, and a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say, for evil he brought them forth, to slay them in the mountains and consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from your fierce wrath and change your mind concerning this evil against your people. Not only did Moses want God to keep his promise, but his reasoning behind his wanting this promise kept was to protect God's own reputation. Moses' immediate reaction and righteous thinking saved God's reputation as well as the children of Israel. See for yourself what caused God to change his mind. See for yourself that which gave Moses power with God. God's holy name, God's reputation was at stake. Therefore, God's promise to Abraham must be kept. Verse 13, Moses said, earnestly remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, which is Jacob, your servants, to whom you swore by your own self, and said to them, I will multiply your seed as the stars of the heavens, and all the land that I have spoken of I will give to your seed, and they shall inherit it forever. So Moses is simply saying, Lord, you promised Abraham that you would multiply his seed as the stars, and these people are the beginning of your promise. You also told him that these descendants of his would inherit that special piece of land you keep telling us about. Lord, all the Egyptians and other nations are watching to see if your word is good. They're watching to see if you keep covenant. So if you fail to keep your promise, your reputation will be ruined. Lord, you must not destroy this people in your anger, even though they deserve to die. Your reputation, your name must come first. Because of God's covenant with Abraham, God's hand was stayed. Verse 14. Then the Lord turned from the evil which he had thought to do his people. Did you notice how the Jews are once again called his people? They are his people because he promised Abraham that he would be their God. It's quite clear that God's promise to Abraham was the main factor in this event. Moses had power with God because he put God in remembrance of that promise, and by doing so, he turned away God's anger. Moses knew that God would keep his promise. He knew God would keep his promise to protect his own holy name. Also, he would keep it out of love for Abraham, which was one of the reasons he had made such a promise in the first place. What a wonderful, righteous God we serve, who keeps his promise even when it directly affects and hurts him. He spared this multitude of people who had humiliated him. He spared a people who had broken his heart, a people who were rebellious and disobedient, a people who were grumblers and complainers, evil and corrupt. And he did it in order to keep a promise he had made to a man, to one righteous man. God went on suffering this humiliation and hurt generation after generation for a twofold reason: to keep his promise and to protect his holy name. What a God! What a Savior! I know that after this lesson is over, those of you who truly love God will want to obey his word and begin to intercede for Israel. When you put forth the effort to intercede in prayer for Israel, if you want to take full advantage of those efforts and have the kind of power with God that Moses had, then you must do as Moses did. Put God in remembrance of his promise to Abraham. If you do this, then I tell you, on the authority of God's word, God will hear you just as surely as he heard Moses. And for his name's sake, he will answer your righteous prayer. For his own reputation is involved in whatever happens to Israel. It could be that God has already dealt with you about praying for Israel, even before you began listening to this tape lesson. If this is so, God is now showing you through his word on this tape how he wants you to pray for Israel and why he wants you to pray for Israel. On the other hand, if you have not been praying for Israel, you are now aware that God requires that you do pray for Israel. Whichever category you may fall into, you now know that when you obey God and pray for Israel, you must remind God of his promise to Abraham, so that he will arise and keep that promise, and thus protect his name throughout all the earth. God is calling Christians to intercede for Israel. Are you being called by God this very moment? Isaiah 62, 6-7. God says, I have set watchmen upon your walls, O Jerusalem, who will never hold their peace day or night. You who are his servants, and by your prayers put the Lord in remembrance of his promise. Keep not silence, and give him no rest until he establishes Jerusalem and makes it a praise in the earth. God wants Jerusalem to be a praise in the earth. God wants Israel to be established. And when you pray to this end, you are praying in God's will. When you pray in this manner, you are concerning yourself about God. You are concerning yourself about God's name, about God's reputation. God must keep covenant with Abraham, or his word will never again be trusted by man. Won't you do as Moses did and consider God's reputation first? The wrongs and mistakes and even the sins of Israel are secondary compared to God's holy name. Won't you let God know that you now understand why he has put up with the wickedness of Israel for so long? Won't you tell God how much you admire the fact that he would allow himself to be put through so much in order to keep his promise? Because you have seen his righteousness in this situation, won't you let him know how much you trust him? Don't be like those who twist God's word to gain for themselves, those who try to claim promises that God did not make in the first place, or promises that God did make, yet they do not pertain to them. Be unselfish. Think of God's reputation. Claim the true and righteous promises, such as those made to Abraham for Israel. God made these promises for Israel. Claim them for Israel, and in doing so you will be helping God. Put God in remembrance of these true promises. These promises that will accomplish God's will and glorify his name throughout the earth. Pray that God's promise will be kept, so all men will say, God kept his word to righteous Abraham. What a great God he is. Let all men praise the name of the Lord. Oh, if only Christians would think of God's name first. If they did this, they could then help God to glorify his name in all the earth. But instead, most Christians and Jews alike are so caught up with themselves, they are blinded to the true priorities and purposes of God. God loves the Jews, the descendants of Abraham. He loves them with an everlasting love, as it is written in Jeremiah 31:3. Verse 3. The Lord appeared of old to me, Israel, saying, Yes, I have loved you with an everlasting love. Therefore with loving kindness have I drawn you, and have continued my faithfulness to you. Now you might say, how can God love these people with an everlasting love when they're so hard-hearted and sinful? Or I can understand God putting up with them now that I know about his promise. But I'll never understand why he continues to love them like he does. But the truth is, this also involves the promise. A part of the promise God made with Abraham was that he would love Israel with a steadfast love. In the American Heritage Dictionary, the word steadfast is defined as such, quote, fixed or unchanging, firmly loyal or constant, unquote. God's love for Israel, like everything else, had nothing to do with her being deserving of his love, any more than we Christians are deserving of God's love through Jesus Christ. But it had everything to do with God's promise to their forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Deuteronomy 7:6-13. Verse 6. For you are a holy and set-apart people to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a special people to himself out of all the peoples on the face of the earth. And we know why, don't we? Verse 7. The Lord did not set his love upon you and choose you because you were more in number than any other people, for you were the fewest of all people. So God is telling them that he did not choose them, nor love them, nor bring them out of Egypt because they were attractive in any way. They were not deserving of that love. They were not deserving of that choice. However, he goes on to tell them again why he did choose and deliver them. Verse 8. But because the Lord loves you, and because he would keep the oath which he had sworn to your fathers, the Lord has brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you out of the house of bondage from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. The Lord's love for Israel was part of his total promise to Abraham, as we will see. And here, through Moses, God was verbally expressing his love. Verse 9. Know, recognize, and understand therefore that the Lord your God, he is God, the faithful God, who keeps covenant and steadfast love and mercy with those who love him and keep his commandments to 1,000 generations. So Moses says to the descendants of Abraham, look at the faithfulness of the God you serve. God kept his promise to Abraham because Abraham kept God's commands, which was part of the agreement. Because Abraham obeyed God's commands, God was able to keep his promise to him. And you are the proof that God has kept it and will continue to keep it to 1,000 generations. But when people hate God, and show they do by disobeying his commands, then it's a different story. God will not put up with deliberate disobedience. Had Abraham been disobedient, he would never have gained for Israel what he did. Verse 10. And repays those who hate him to their face by destroying them. He will not be slack to him who hates him, but will requite him to his face. Then Moses goes on to say to Israel, if you will keep God's commands, then God will keep his promise to Abraham in regard to you. If you will keep God's commands, then that same covenant will be yours. You will receive the benefits of all God promised Abraham, including God's love. Verse 11. You shall therefore keep and do the instructions, laws, and precepts which I command you this day. And if you hearken to these precepts and keep and do them, the Lord your God will keep with you the covenant and the steadfast love which he swore to your fathers. So God swore that he would love them with a steadfast, fixed, or unchanging love. Let me read verses 9 through 13 from the Living Bible. Understand, therefore, that the Lord your God is the faithful God who for 1,000 generations keeps his promises and constantly loves those who love him and who obey his commands. But those who hate him shall be punished publicly and destroyed. He will deal with them personally. Therefore, obey all these commandments I am giving you today. Because of your obedience, the Lord your God will keep his part of the contract, which in his tender love he made with your fathers. Now here is God's part of the contract in verse 13, and notice that he says, God will love them. Verse 13. And he will love you and bless you and make you into a great nation, all part of the covenant. He will make you fertile and give fertility to all your ground and to your animals, so that you will have large crops of grain, grapes and olives, and great flocks of cattle, sheep and goats, when you arrive in the land he promised your fathers to give you. The covenant with Abraham is everlasting. So, of course, the love that is given to Israel is also everlasting, since that love is a part of the covenant. Christian, you now know why God chose the Jew and why he loves them with a steadfast love. You also know why God gave them the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession. Everything God did in regard to Israel, from their deliverance from the bondage of Egypt to the pouring out of his love upon them, was a direct result of the covenant. He promised he would do all these things, and God is faithful to keep his word. But despite God's love for Israel, God could not and would not tolerate sinful disobedience to his word. Moses warned the Israelites of this time and time again, telling them that God would not put up with disobedience to his commands. Moses told them that if they refused to obey God's instructions, his teachings, his commands, God would drive them off the land he had given them. However, he also told them that in the end of time, if they repented and began to obey God's commands, God would not forget his covenant with Abraham, and God would bring them back to Israel and allow them to take possession of their land once again. As we read on, you'll be able to see how these scriptures have already come true. Amplified Bible, Deuteronomy 4:23 through 31. Moses warns, "Take heed to yourselves, lest you forget the covenant of the Lord your God, which he made with you, and make you a graven image in the form of anything which the Lord your God has forbidden you. For the Lord your God is a consuming fire, a jealous God. When your children shall be born to you, and children's children, and you have grown old in the land, if you corrupt yourselves by making a graven image in the form of anything, and do evil in the sight of the Lord your God, provoking him to anger, I call heaven and earth to witness against you this day, that you shall soon utterly perish from off the land which you are going over the Jordan to possess. You will not live long upon it, but will be utterly destroyed. The Lord will scatter you among the peoples, and you will be left few in number among the nations to which the Lord will drive you. There you will serve gods, the work of men's hands, wood and stone, which neither see nor hear nor eat nor smell." Now, as history shows us, this very thing happened. The Jews were scattered to the four corners of the earth, and the Jewish population was diminished considerably. However, in this present generation, God has remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God heard their cry, and in a single day, as prophesied, Israel became a nation again, and the Jews flocked back to Israel to inherit their land, the land of Israel, which was given to them by God for an everlasting inheritance. So let's see why God is helping them again in this, the end of time, verse 29. "But if from there you will seek, inquire of, and require as necessity the Lord your God, you will find him. If you truly seek him with all your heart and mind and soul and life. When you are in tribulation, and all these things come upon you in the latter days, if you turn to the Lord your God and are obedient to his voice," remember the tribulation the Jews suffered during the Second World War. 6 million Jews were exterminated in Germany by the Nazis. During this time, they obviously cried out to God and reminded him of his promise to Abraham, since the promise was and is the key, as it is written in God's word in verse 31. For the Lord your God is a merciful God. He will not fail you or destroy you, or forget the covenant of your fathers which he swore to them. Listen, Christian. In Moses' day, even though they sinned, God spared them because he couldn't break covenant. Just as today, though they refused to recognize Jesus Christ, Yeshua, as Messiah, God still cannot break covenant with righteous Abraham. So to keep his promise, God has allowed the Jews to go back to the land of Israel, their promised possession. They must be on their own land when Yeshua, Jesus Christ, the Anointed One, comes back to earth for the second time. At that time, a remnant of the Jews will accept Jesus as Messiah. So for the sake of God's name, his reputation, we all must help God carry out his plan in regard to his promise to Abraham. Be joyful when God blesses Israel. Shout for joy when you see the Jews claiming more and more of the promised land, the land that was promised to the Israelites, the descendants of Abraham and Isaac. Who else should claim it? It is theirs. It is theirs by right. Be glad when Israel prospers. Weep when she is hurting or in need. Not because of Israel, but for God's name's sake. Help God to keep his promise, so that his name and his righteous character will be exalted before all men. So they will praise him for the fact that he would go through all this to keep a promise he made to a friend thousands of years ago. Oh, Christian, don't you understand? This is the God who promises you eternal life if you accept his Son, Jesus Christ, as your Savior and obey his commands. The fact that he is keeping his promise to Abraham lets you know beyond a doubt that he will keep his promise to you. Again, let's go back in time and pick up where Israel, even though she had been warned by Moses, refused to obey God's word. She did not abide in her part of the covenant that God made with Abraham, nor did she believe that which Moses had prophesied would happen to her if she failed to obey. So in her unbelieving state, she cast God's laws aside. Though she had been warned by all the prophets to turn from her wicked ways, she refused. She rejected God by rejecting his commands, and so God rejected her. God punished her by casting her off the land and sending her into captivity in Babylon, where she remained in exile for 70 years. After the lesson, you can go back and read some of the awful things Israel did to bring about God's chastisement. But we'll pick up in verse 13. 2 Kings 17, 13 through 23. Verse 13. Yet the Lord warned Israel and Judah by all the prophets and all the seers, saying, Turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments and my statutes according to all the law which I commanded your fathers, and which I sent to you by my servants the prophets. Yet they would not hear, but hardened their necks as did their fathers who did not believe, trust and rely on, and remain steadfast to the Lord their God. Verse 15. They despised and rejected his statutes and his covenant, which he made with their fathers, and his warnings to them. And they followed vanity, falsehood, emptiness, and futility. And they themselves and their prayers became false, empty, futile. They went after the heathen round about them, of whom the Lord had charged them that they should not do as they did. And they forsook all the commandments of the Lord their God, and made them molten images, even 2 calves, and made an Asherah, and worshipped all the starry host of the heavens, and served Baal. They caused their sons and their daughters to pass through the fire, and used divination and enchantments, and sold themselves to do evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger. This time the Israelites did not have Moses to intercede for them during God's anger. Nevertheless, God remembered his promise anyway. He did not utterly destroy them, though he cast them off the land. God's intention was that they would be allowed to return again in 70 years, so their separation from their heritage was only temporary. Verse 18. Therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel, and removed them out of his sight. None was left but the tribe of Judah only. Judah also did not keep the commandments of the Lord their God. They walked in the customs which Israel introduced. The Lord rejected all the descendants of Israel, and afflicted them, and delivered them into the hand of spoilers, until he had cast them out of his sight. For he tore Israel from the house of David, and they made Jeroboam son of Nebat king, and Jeroboam drew and drove Israel away from following the Lord, and made them sin a great sin. For the Israelites walked in all the sins Jeroboam committed. They departed not from them, until the Lord removed Israel from his sight, as he had foretold by all his servants the prophets. So Israel was carried away from their own land to Assyria to this day. God had driven the Canaanites off the promised land because of their wickedness. He had also been long-suffering with them, but they had gone from bad to worse, and now here was Israel acting as wickedly as the Canaanites had acted after dispossessing them and inheriting their land. Deuteronomy 9:4-5. Verse 4. God says to Israel, "Do not say in your mind and heart, after the Lord your God has thrust them out from before you, it is because of my righteousness that the Lord has brought me in to possess this land. Whereas it is because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is dispossessing them before you. Not for your righteousness or for the uprightness of your mind and heart do you go to possess their land. But because of the wickedness of these nations the Lord your God is driving them out before you, and that he may fulfill the promise which the Lord swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." Israel possessed the land by the power of God, and then became more sinful than the people who had previously lived there. God could not allow Israel to remain on the land in such a sinful state after he had driven the Canaanites off it for these very same sins. So Israel was removed also. God is not partial in his judgments. God is no respecter of persons. Israel was removed from off the land and led away into captivity in Babylon. The people of Israel had taken advantage of God's promise to Abraham just as surely as many Christians try to take advantage of God's grace today. But God is no more fooled by these Christians than he was by Israel. For it is written in Galatians 6:7, verse 7, "Do not be deceived and deluded and misled. God will not allow himself to be sneered at, scorned, disdained, or mocked by mere pretensions or professions or his precepts being set aside. He inevitably deludes himself who attempts to delude God. For whatever a man sows, that and that only is what he will reap. For he who sows to his own flesh, lower nature, sensuality, will from the flesh reap decay and ruin and destruction. But he who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap life eternal." The people of Israel had taken advantage of God's grace, favor, and goodness, and had caused God to move against them in anger. But this did not change anything as far as God's promise was concerned. The covenant still remained and had to be kept. So 70 years later, the Jews repented and reminded God of his promise to Abraham. True to his word, God allowed them to return home as he had prophesied that he would. But I'm sad to say this sinfulness broke out again, and blatant disobedience to God's commands was practiced everywhere. God continued to chastise Israel. He made every effort to get them back on the right path, but they would not do right by God's standards. So finally, as Jesus prophesied almost 2,000 years ago, the total destruction of Jerusalem was accomplished by the Romans about 70 years after Christ's death. The Jews were scattered throughout the whole earth. They did not have a homeland until Israel became a nation in a day in 1948. Since then, the Jews have been slowly returning to their homeland, the Promised Land, as God said they would in the end of time. You can read this in Deuteronomy 29:31. The stage is being set for God to complete his everlasting promise to Abraham. Eventually, all the world will be looking on to see God keep his solemn pledge in all its fullness. After hearing this portion of our lesson, there should be no doubt in your mind as to why God chose the Jewish nation. He chose the Jewish nation in order to keep his promise to Abraham. But you may be thinking, yes, I now know why he chose Abraham's descendants. But what in the world caused him to choose Abraham in the first place? This is easily answered. God had a plan. He wanted mankind to begin to make an effort to do what they were created to do. Let's begin at the beginning. Let's see first of all God's full purpose for creating mankind. Ecclesiastes 12:13. All has been heard. The end of the matter is, fear God and keep his commandments. For this is the whole of man, the full original purpose of his creation, the object of God's providence, the root of character, the foundation of all happiness, the adjustment to all inharmonious circumstances and conditions under the sun, and the whole duty for every man. Men were not doing what they had been created to do. It was time for God to begin the process that would lead them back to the paths of righteousness. To do this, God needed a man who would believe his word, a man who would trust him implicitly, a man who would obey him. God found such a man. The man's name was Abram, who was later called Abraham. The first thing God asked of Abraham involved total sacrifice and obedience. He instructed Abraham to leave his own country and even his relatives and to go to the land of Canaan. How would you react if God asked this of you? But God told Abraham that if he obeyed him, he would greatly bless him. Abraham passed the test. He believed God. Leaving everything behind him except his wife and nephew and his servants and belongings, he went forth to the land of Canaan as God had directed. You can read all about this after the lesson is over in Genesis chapter 12. Abraham had obeyed God, so God could now accomplish the next step of his plan. He promised Abraham an heir, a son. This would not have been so incredible except for the fact that Sarah, Abraham's wife, was barren and very old. In Genesis chapter 15, God also tells Abraham that his descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the heavens. Again, Abraham believed God would carry out his promise. So God goes on to tell him that he brought him to this place to give it to his descendants as an inheritance, but that certain things will have to take place before this will be accomplished. He tells Abraham, your descendants will dwell in Egypt as strangers for 400 years. They will be afflicted and oppressed during this time. But during the 4th generation, I will deliver them and bring them back to Canaan.